Good evening, everybody. It's so good to be back with you, and we're continuing our series on Jesus Teaches About. Tonight, we're talking about Jesus Teaches About giving, specifically giving to those in need, and this is found in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And I just remind you that we're covering these topics because it's all about being Jesus followers, not about being good church people, being religious people, even being what some term spiritual people, because all of those things can happen without doing one thing that Jesus says. And yet, if we're going to be Jesus followers, that means we actually follow what he says. And you'll find through the course of these teachings that Jesus very often contrasts what's going on in the world, the things that he's seeing. He'll say, you've heard it taught, or you've heard it said, or this is what's being practiced. And then he gives a contrast with his way, the way that he intended it to be, the deeper spiritual principles of why these things are being done and why he's saying what he's saying. And it's amazing that we see that it's so relevant for today, that we've drifted so far from being people that truly love and honor God and truly love and honor people. And this is what Jesus teaches about a lot. Most of his life, most of his teaching, most of his time was spent dealing with people and taking the time for people. The group of followers that he had around him, he hand-selected them to be very different people. They weren't all drones and all having the same personalities and just being followers, but there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of mess going on within that small group of 12 that he initially chose, because he thought and knew that if I can change them, if I can get them to love each other and to follow me and to use these principles versus just the letter of the law, then we can change the world. And I would put it to you to say this: if we, as Jesus followers, those of us that truly love and want to do what Jesus teaches, if we'll be those type of people as well, we will see the world around us change as well. Now remember, it didn't change all at once. Even in Jesus' time, it took a long time. But as we continue to practice this, as we continue to live it out, despite adversity, despite government, despite things that come our way, when we continue to hold these things as values and principles and eternal systems instead of cultural values and worldly systems, then everything begins to fall into place. So we're going to be teaching out of Matthew chapter 6, 4 simple verses, 1 through 4. As always, if you've got questions, hopefully we've got answers, and you can comment during this premiere. You can send me an email. You can go to our website. You can direct message me on Messenger. There's all that information right there. There's no reason for us to not get to the bottom of our questions and to share our contrasting views. And we can live and love together, even if we don't agree, or even if we don't always believe everything exactly the same way. That's the wonder of Christ's world and how he wants us to be as human beings, is we don't always have to see exactly the way somebody else sees. But the reality is that we should hold the values that he has, and sometimes it looks different how I walk that out versus how you walk that out, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes he's very specific on this is how it should be, and this is what I expect. So as we look at this tonight, just realize it's 4 simple verses, and I'm using the New Living Translation tonight because I just think it flows a little bit better with our modern language. So here's what it says. He says, watch out. Don't do your good deeds publicly to be rewarded by others or admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do it as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and the streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. Now, I'm going to include in this, even though he doesn't say it specifically, it holds up true with the rest of the scripture. Like if you read verse 4 and it says, give your gifts in private, or these acts. Also understand that if we look at Ephesians, that we've been all given gifts, and we're supposed to use those gifts for the benefit of others. So it's not just giving your gifts, but using your gifts. When you're using your gifts, don't do it as the hypocrites do, blowing the trumpets, calling attention to yourself, or you're not actually helping the body. But that's for another time and maybe another message series along the way. So I just hope that you see the prime principle behind this is that he's saying, hey, when you're doing what you should be doing, and I'm going to set that precedent way up front here, is that he expects us to do good deeds. We're not people that just sit back and receive and expect to be served, or we don't care anything about our fellow man. Jesus comes from the understanding that if you're a follower of me, if you truly are saved, then you are doing good deeds. You are doing charitable work. You are serving others. And if you're in a spot right now where you're not doing that, today's a great day to change that, because it is contrary to the lifestyle of a Christian. Christians don't just operate in their own little vacuum. Christians are designed and made and saved for the service of other people, first to God and then to others. So again, no judgment, no condemnation, and no guilt. Just realize that's not the principle of a kingdom relationship or one that calls himself a Jesus follower. And it's just as easy as making an adjustment today of saying, I'm not going to be a person that only takes, that only sits and watches, that never serves, that never gives, that never does what Jesus asked me to do. I'm going to be somebody that actually follows the principles that Jesus has prescribed for us. So let's look at these verse by verse here. So verse 1, contrary to worldly values, Jesus actually expects us to do good deeds because we love God and people, not to be seen, not to have it posted on Facebook, not to do the Twitter, not to show the great example on Instagram. It is to be done because we love God and we love people. Now, this is a very different thing for our world, that if we had to see everything streamed on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, we'd find that we would call most of ourselves hypocrites, because we only put out the best. We only put out the product that we want people to see. We don't throw out our tantrums. We don't put out there our horrible arguments or our harsh words towards other people, or even worse, our heart motives. So I'm just telling you that Jesus is doing a contrast. He's talking to people in a world that understood that, hey, there's things that are like these public values, but we don't really hold them in our heart. But Jesus is saying, if you don't change your heart, then you're never going to be able to change the public issues as well. So he does this contrast of saying, I expect you to do good deeds, not because you get seen, but because you love God and you love people. Now, also in verse 1, Jesus reveals that God tends to reward what man does. And it's the seen versus the unseen, right? God tends to look at what we do, not to be seen, more the eternal, the not temporal, the not material. God looks at those things in a very different way than we look at those things. And understand that just because the world doesn't see it doesn't mean that it's gone unnoticed, whether that be good or bad. There's a lot of judgment that's being stored up, bad things that are going to be stored up, but we don't see it happen now. But God has noticed, and there's tons of great things that have happened that nobody understood. There was no recognition given, but God still saw it, and God is the one that gives those rewards. So if you're doing the right things, even though it seems like nobody's noticing, I'm here to tell you that from the lips of Jesus, God notices, and you've got his attention when you do these things without having to worry about recognition and without having to think about, well, I'm the one that first did it, or I'm the one that did it better, or any of that stuff. There's no winning or losing. It's just our motives that Jesus is really trying to get at, because our motives will guide our actions, and our motives will reveal who we truly are on the inside. Now, as we look at verse 2, amazingly, Jesus expects us to be doing good and charitable deeds. I talked about that a little bit before, but I remind you again, it's if versus when. He doesn't say if you decide to do charitable deeds. In fact, he says when you do your charitable deeds. So it's not really an option. All he's saying is that when you do it, as you do it, because this is your lifestyle and you do it, not just when people are watching. Rather, because of compassion and good motives. You don't have to wait for the camera to be rolling. You don't have to wait for Facebook to post it. You don't have to wait for the crowd to gather. You don't have to wait for the newspaper to show up. We should be doing the good deeds if nobody's around, if nobody takes notice, if nobody says thank you. Now, this is hard because we live in a world that is very pain and reward oriented. We tend to do the things again and again and again that we get rewarded for. But Jesus is saying that can become a trap, because what happens if you get rewarded for bad behavior? We've seen this in the world just recently, where people are doing horrible things, ungodly things, illegal things, and yet there's no punishment and there seems to be reward. And so when this happens again and again and again, we shouldn't be surprised, because you know what? We rewarded bad behavior. Jesus, on the other hand, says, hey, our behavior is not about reward and punishment. Our behavior is because God has asked us to do it. It's eternal value and a system that's put into place because we honor God and we honor people. And he contrasts this by saying, don't act like the hypocrites. There's other people doing the same thing you're doing it, but they have a different motive. And this is what he's saying. And I remind you that hypocrite means an actor. It literally means one behind the mask. It means an actor playing a role. And if you've seen on TV, especially commercials, you'll see this funny little fine print at the bottom that says, these are real people, not actors. Now, I'm not suggesting that actors aren't real people, but what it's really trying to tell you is that this isn't a real patient. This isn't a real client. This is somebody that was paid to act like they use this stuff. This is the contrast that he's giving, is there's a lot of people that act like this is their real value system, but it's very far from their heart motives. It's very far from the way that God wanted it to be done. It's not done out of some good altruistic principle. It's because they wanted to be seen. And in the Old King James, it's a word, you've probably never even heard this word that I put up on the screen, a dissembler. And what this really means, it's a more detailed definition than a hypocrite. A dissembler means that somebody that adopts some values or some roles because they want people to think that they have these values, but they really don't have these values, and they're trying to portray something that is not true. So don't be a dissembler. In fact, I think you can maybe integrate that into your conversation maybe this week as you're watching this. And maybe as we find people that we see are exposed, maybe we just point and we say, oh, there's a dissembler. And somebody won't even know what we mean. They may think we're giving them a compliment, but we know exactly what that means. It means somebody that doesn't have that at their heart value. They're actually covering up their true motives so that they won't know, so that no one will know what their true values and motive system is. Also in verse 2, I would ask this question, where do you want your glory to come from? Because Jesus says, when you do this in such a way, you're trying to get your glory from men. You love the applause. You love all the Facebook likes. You like it when everybody hits the heart button on your Instagram. You like it when people follow you on Twitter. You like to have people respond positively to you. But I ask again, where do you want your glory to come from? God or men? At the end of our days, when everything's tallied and we're giving our account of our life and our values and our metrics to God, do you want it to be from men that he gives you glory? Or do you want God to find you valuable and bring you glory? It's a great question. The great part is there's reward in both. If you just want men, you'll get your reward, but just expect that there'll be no reward in eternity if you make it there. But if you don't care what men think and you don't need the applause and the praise of men, then just realize that you're going to get a standing ovation from Jesus when the time comes. And he said, well done, good and faithful servant. Because that's what I'm about. people's opinions are going to change. Everything that you do, whether it's good or not, somebody's going to think you did it wrong. Somebody's going to think you did it with a wrong motive. Somebody's going to think you did it just because people were watching. And it doesn't matter. All those things change over time, but God isn't changing, and He knows our hearts and our true value system. So do you want your glory from men or from God? I hope that you want your glory from God. Moving on to verse 3. He begins to use this illustration of not allowing your left hand to know what your right hand is doing. And I'm just going to tell you, it has nothing to do with our actual hands, but rather it's just an illustration. He's using a verbal tool to get people to think about it. Now, why this was so important for him is that in those days, in those times, because of their culture, they had a clean hand and a dirty hand. And in almost all the cases, the left hand was the dirty hand. It was the act of service. It was the hand that was normally reserved for dirty work. And the right hand was the one that you raised to take an oath. The right hand was the one that you used for clean work, to serve God, to take your vows, to eat, to do all those things. And the left hand was not. So he's saying, don't let these things get confused. You don't want the hand that you wipe with to be the hand that you eat with. And I know maybe that sounds a little vulgar or graphic, but that's really what he's trying to say is don't get these two things mixed up. He's like, what you've got to do is you've got to understand it's about having the right motives. When and why you do things is important. Are you doing it now because it benefits you? Are you doing it right now because people are watching? Are you doing it just to get the raise? Are you doing it hoping that somehow you're going to get somebody's attention, an extra like, an extra benefit, an extra reward from men? When you do it and why you do it is utmost importance to God because He sees the motives. And for the world, we tend to just see what we see instead of thinking through, I wonder why they did it like that. And so we have to be people that have pure motives. And it doesn't mean that we don't get joy out of doing something, but it has to be the right motives to begin with. I believe there's incredible joy in serving, but there's also incredible joy at times when you serve and nobody notices. And so if you can find the internal value of finding joy in serving, whether you get a thank you or not, you get a much bigger reward than sitting there with bated breath, waiting for the thank you card, waiting for the, oh man, that was so nice of you, waiting for the person to look your way, waiting for the pat on the back. Because if that's withheld, then we feel like, well, that wasn't worth it, and we probably stop doing the good deed, which reveals our motives. Also in verse 3, we need to follow a principle of doing what is good or charitable, even if it doesn't benefit us, especially when it doesn't benefit us. This is world versus kingdom values. You see, the world is all about getting ahead. I'll do this if I get this. But the question is, would you do that if there was no reward? Would you do that even if it's a good thing, if nobody said thank you, if nobody sent you a gift, if nobody responded in kind? In fact, if it came the opposite and you were actually felt the heat and the pressure or the bad deed that followed from your good work, would you do it again? It's a good question. He's saying that we follow these principles, whether we agree with them or not, or whether we ever get noticed. And this, I would refer you back to last week where we talked about going the extra mile. There was no reward for that. You know what the reward was? You did the law. Great. Move along. They didn't even have to acknowledge it. But imagine if you can find the ability inside that I love God enough and I love people enough that I don't need the reward. I don't need some material thing given to me. I don't need the thanks and the praise. If it comes, great, but that's not why I'm doing it. I don't need 15,000 followers on any social media device. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. In fact, I'm going to do my good deeds and not put them on social media. What a concept. Isn't that amazing? Imagine that. We actually did a good deed. We actually raised some money. We actually changed a life without putting it out on social media. Because you and I have both heard this principle right here. It didn't really happen if it wasn't on Facebook. And how absurd is that? Lots of great, powerful, wonderful things happen that are never on Facebook. In fact, up until just these last few years, everything happened before it was on Facebook because there was no Facebook. So I'm just asking you to be a thinker and don't just be a drone that follows the ways of this world and gets caught up in the current of this culture. We need to be people that hold the values whether the world accepts it or not, whether the culture values it or not. We have to have kingdom values, not world values. Verse 4. You see, it's not about gaining that recognition. We talked a little bit about that. It's not about the reward of the praise. Now, it's not saying that you better make sure you don't get any of that or it's a waste. But it's, again, the motive. If you do a good thing and you don't care if you get praise or recognition or reward, but it comes, it's not wasted. It's still a good thing. But it's not about those things, because those become that misleading trap that pretty soon we start to do things and we get trained to do things. In fact, we get trained to only do the things that have reward. I think about growing up as a kid in a small town. We lived in a little cul-de-sac when we moved into town, and across the street were some elderly people. And in the town where I grew up, we would get snow every winter. And my mom or my dad would say, generally my mom would say, go get the snow shovel and go over and shovel out the Rasmussen's driveway and their front step. And I remember early on asking why, or thinking, oh good, they'll give me some money. And I remember saying that, and she goes, they're not even home. We just do it because it's the right thing to do. Now great, if they decide to come out and say, hey, here's some hot chocolate, or hey, here's $3. Then it's not about haggling over the price or even feeling offended like, what? $3 after working for 4 hours? Are you kidding me? Because it's not about that at all. I'm just thankful that an elderly couple had a safe environment and that they were neighbors. They were people that I saw almost every day walking around in the neighborhood, playing in my neighborhood. And what a great example that has almost disappeared from our culture today because people are so worried about what somebody's going to give them in return. And we say, well, it's not worth it. Well, worth has nothing to do with it. It's a value system, whether you get praise or recognition or reward or not. It's like serving God. If nobody notices and nothing seems good to come out of it in this world, which is highly unlikely, but even if it does, at the end, when we give an account before God, you're still going to hear him say, with his eyes lighting up with pride and joy, well done, good and faithful servant. And he's going to say these words, enter into your not only rest, but your reward. You see, he notices, and there will be a reward. And to borrow from a line from Gladiator, what we do in this life does echo in eternity, both good and bad. So we have to get over ourselves. We have to shuck off our cultural values and be able to say, I'm going to do what's supposed to be done because God says it's what we're supposed to be done, not because it was so much time or something I'm going to get in return. Also in verse 4, he says that our principles and our values should reflect an eternal or spiritual system rather than a material or corrupt system. When he says you're doing your good deeds because you're hoping to get the reward, and he really says if that's all you're doing, it's an empty reward. You're just getting the applause that you got, the newspaper article that you got, that's it. That's your reward. Versus, how about the eternal reward? How about the thing inside of you that drives you that like, man, that was a really great thing that I did, and I hope God is pleased, and I'm going to do that no matter what. You see, we have to choose not to embrace a material and a corrupt system. Even in the Old Testament, there was a time when the priests of old used to be dependent on people for their food and their lifestyle. And then pretty soon they wanted more than people were giving, and they began to get corrupt, and they began to demand things from people that God did not demand. And God stopped all that. He actually said, my priesthood has become corrupt, and we've got to stop this mess and start over. And judgment fell on a whole generation of priests. You see, we're just people, And we're easily corrupted. That's why we have to have values on the inside that aren't from our own design, but from a designed creator who is perfect in every way and sees past our corrupt system because he is incorruptible. And it's hard for us when we feel it. We're like, man, why would I do this? Why would I put the extra work in? Because it's the right thing to do. And I know that goes against a lot of our world values, but we don't have to respond in kind. When somebody is horrible to us, we shouldn't repay evil for evil. The Bible even says that. Do not repay evil for evil, but repay evil with good. You see, that's a value system. That's a lifestyle, not I'm going to make them pay for what they did, or even worse, just I'm going to ignore it and go my way. We have to be people that are active, that when the evil comes, we actually overthrow that evil with good. Not just nullify it, but we actually overthrow it with good. Let's talk through a little bit of life application as we wrap this up. You see, we have 3 ways from Scripture that allows us to check our motives. First is generosity. Matthew 6:4 talks about this. We should be generous people that do generous works. And if we feel like, I can't afford that, or man, we begin to second guess it, then we have to ask, is it coming from a selfish background, or is it coming from a heart of generosity? And it has nothing to do with money per se, but many people are generous and it has nothing to do with how much they spend or how much they give to charity. It's just their generous lifestyle. And that's the thing. Are you doing it out of generosity? Secondly, are you doing it out of prayer? We're going to talk about this next week where he reveals this in Matthew 6:6. Have you prayed about it? Is it the right thing to do and it's confirmed during your prayer time? If so, then regardless of what it costs you, regardless of whether there's reward or not, then it's something we should be doing. Another thing to couple with all 3 of those that is fasting, and that helps reveal our motives and challenges our spirit. When we fast about something, it aligns us with God and His Word, and it helps move away a lot of the obstacles, blockages, and our own natural limitations to want to do things that God, through prayer and fasting, not just fasting alone, but through prayer and fasting and our generous acts, it actually helps purify our motives. So we should be people that when we're like, man, is there something I should do? Take some time to pray about it. Take some time to fast. Take some time to think, is this a generous thing to do or is this a selfish thing to do? You see, our acts should be God-centered. Would this bring glory to God, or is this to bring glory to me? Am I doing this to elevate God and His way of life, or is this done so that my thoughts and my position is elevated? You see, these should be done to elevate God, not us. Jesus talks about this a lot. The greatest in the kingdom is the one that serves. He said to those, the 12 around him, if you want to know who's going to be the greatest, you're the one that's willing to stoop and wash the feet of everybody else. And he actually did it to show them as an example. And that's pretty amazing that very often do we stoop down and remove ourselves from our elevated positions to serve those in the dirtiest, most needed positions. We tend to want somebody else to do that for us, or we'd rather pay somebody to do that for us. But what happens when it's not about the pay? It's actually about being humble enough and generous enough and prayerful enough to go and do the good deeds because they should be done, not because there's a reward, and not because we just had some free time. I've heard that excuse almost all, I just don't have time. You had plenty of time to play Call of Duty for 3 hours. You had plenty of time to online shop. You had plenty of time to binge watch Downton Abbey. We had plenty of time to play golf. We had plenty of time for fantasy sports. We do have the time. The problem is that our time reveals our motives. Now, even though he doesn't specifically say this, this is found in many other places in the New Testament specifically, where our deeds should have a sacrifice associated with it. You see, we should be people that understand sacrifice, the sacrifice of our praise. That means we praise even when we don't feel like it. Sacrifice of our time. That means we serve even when, I would rather take a nap. You see, sacrifice is what Jesus is all about. And so our deeds should almost have a tint or a smell of sacrifice about them, not because it should be painful, but because it removes the selfish factor. If it's something that costs us, then it probably is something that Jesus would do. It's probably something that would motivate him and he would say, well done. And when I say a cost factor, I don't mean that you spend something on yourself or buy something, but I mean something that's a sacrifice to you. It's not about reaching in and pulling out $5. It's about, well, it would have been easier to do the $5, but I'm going to actually go down to Community House and serve some meals. And it's the last thing I want to do, but it's probably the thing that would help more people and actually bring humility and bring some joy in me, but it has nothing to do with some happy feeling. Our deeds should have some sacrifice associated with them, not to make it painful, but to weed out our selfishness and our huge wastes of time where we spend vast portions of our time lounging and spending it on ourselves. So how would we know this? Here's one way to do this. Ask yourself this question: would I still do this if no one would ever know that I did it? It's a great question. If you were going to do this thing and you couldn't post it to Facebook, if you couldn't mention it in Twitter, if you couldn't set up a challenge that was going to be videoed, would you still do it? If you knew that nobody in this life would take notice, would never know that you ever did it, would you still do it? That's a great question to check your motives and see, is it something done from the heart and from your value system that lines with God, or is it still based in the corruptible world of pain and reward? Now, I know this sounds pretty contrary, and I hope I'm not stirring up a bunch of mess in your life, but I'm just telling you this: if we're going to be people that are going to make a difference, it's going to be from this value system, not a corrupt value system. It's going to be from a value system that follows God, who honors people even to the point of sacrifice, instead of being people that continually go out of our way to serve ourselves and ignore the world around us and the multiple needs and the multiple hurts and the multiple compassion that needs to be shared. So again, Jesus has this value system for giving specifically to charitable and needy causes. And it's not just about reaching into your wallet. How about you keep the wallet closed for a change and actually go and help someone physically? Actually go and sit by the bed of a patient and pray with them. Actually go and serve the meals. Actually go and give blood. There's tons of places to serve. It's too easy to set up a GoFundMe account. It's too easy to drop a $5 or maybe even a $20 if you're feeling guilty into an offering bag. It's something altogether different that you give up your Saturday to go and build a house for Habitats for Humanity. So I hope that you're doing well. Know that you are loved. Know that God is watching and that there is a reward for your values and your motives. And until I see you next week, God bless.